Case 1. Ray Charles. In a smoky recording studio sometime in the mid-1950s, long after midnight, when Ray Charles was supposed to be wrapping up an album session, the engineers could hear the difference before they saw it. The slight drag in his timing, the uneven pressure on the keys, and that unmistakable slur in his usually razor-sharp voice. Ray sat at the piano, dark glasses on, shoulders heavy, one hand hovering over the keys like a man fighting gravity itself. He was surrounded by musicians who adored him, but nobody dared say what everyone knew. Night after night, Ray was drinking himself sick. The genius was undeniable. The pain was, too. And in the quiet moments between takes, when the microphone stopped and the studio fell silent, Ray Charles would lean back and take another swig, hiding a secret habit that threatened everything he had worked for. Ray didn't become a legend by accident. He rose from poverty in Georgia, lost his sight by age 7, and learned to feel music with his entire body. Gospel, jazz, country, blues, everything lived in his voice and his piano. By the time he broke into national fame, with hits like I Got a Woman and What I Say, he was rewriting the language of American music. But fame carries its own demons, and alcohol quickly became more than a bad habit. Ray drank to numb the pressure, to silence memories of childhood trauma, and to battle the loneliness that haunted him on the road. At first, he controlled it. A drink before a show, a drink to unwind afterward. Then the drinking became ritual, routine, medication, and in the shadows of hotel rooms and backstage corridors, Ray found himself chasing relief instead of perfection. As the drinking escalated, cracks formed in the life everyone else thought was solid. Bandmates noticed that some nights he was late to the stage, hands trembling slightly over the keys until the adrenaline kicked in. Producers saw entire sessions disappear into chaos when Ray became irritable or unfocused. And critics began whispering that the man who could once hear every musical detail was beginning to drown his genius in the bottle. But the most devastating moments came behind closed doors. Friends tried to talk to him, only to be met with charm, deflection, or silence. Ray Charles, the unstoppable musical force, could admit nothing to anyone, not yet. Then came the real turning point, a moment Ray himself would reference years later. His health was slipping, his relationships were suffering, and one night, after a particularly brutal binge where he could barely stand long enough to perform, Ray looked at himself and saw not a legend, not a pioneer, not the genius. He saw a man losing control. The drinking, he finally admitted, wasn't helping him cope, it was destroying him. That honesty cracked the door open for change. Ray entered rehab, a decision few stars of his stature dared make publicly in that era, and committed to recovery. His fight wasn't instantaneous or easy. Addiction rarely gives up that quickly. But Ray Charles, driven by the same relentless determination that made him a musical giant, fought his way back to clarity. In the end, he did something even rarer. He talked about it. Ray publicly acknowledged that addiction nearly ended his career and his life. He became a quiet advocate for getting help, showing fans and fellow musicians that recovery wasn't shameful, it was survival. His music never lost its soul, but his later years carried a different kind of strength. A man who knew what it meant to fall apart and rebuild. The story of Ray Charles is not just a story of sound and success. It's a story of pain, honesty, and the brutal, necessary battle against the bottle to reclaim the brilliance he was born with. Welcome to Savage Case Files, the documentary channel where we go beneath the headlines and dig into the real stories, the real lives, and the real struggles behind the music, ministry, and legacy. We bring you storytelling that's researched, respectful, and brutally honest. If you're enjoying this episode so far, do us one favor, hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything, and it genuinely keeps this channel alive. Your support tells us that you want more powerful documentaries like this one, every single day. That tiny gesture of subscribing helps us keep digging, keep creating, and keep telling the stories that matter. Case 2. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday's voice always sounded like heartbreak wrapped in silk. Raw, vulnerable, defiant. But behind that sound was a life that felt like it never stopped bleeding. Long before the spotlight found her, she was already drowning quietly in a world that seemed unwilling to let a black woman survive without scars. Alcohol became her companion early, a numbing escape from the trauma she carried like a hidden bruise. By the time she stepped onto nightclub stages in Harlem in the 1930s, her talent was undeniable, her charisma magnetic, and her reputation already shadowed by the bottle she kept close by her side. At first, people thought the drinking was just nightlife energy, part of the smoky jazz mystique that surrounded her. But Billie wasn't drinking for aesthetics. She was drinking to forget. To silence the memories of abuse, abandonment, and exploitation. Alcohol softened the chaos in her mind long enough for her to lean into the music, to pour pain into songs like Strange Fruit, which demanded a kind of emotional bravery most people never find. Her voice wasn't trained, it was lived. But every glass she raised after a set pushed her further toward a destiny she could feel but couldn't stop. As fame found her, addiction dug deeper. Hotel rooms, packed audiences, relentless touring schedules, racist booking policies, and brutal industry pressure made sobriety feel like a luxury she couldn't afford. She drank before shows, after shows, and sometimes in between, stacking alcohol on top of other substances. For most of her career, she tried to hide the darkest parts of her addiction behind glamour. Beautiful gowns, immaculate hair, perfectly choreographed stage entrances. But eventually the cracks showed. Notes were missed. Performances slurred. Promoters whispered that she was unreliable, difficult, unstable. The real tragedy hit in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when federal agents targeted Billie relentlessly, partly because of her drug use and partly because of her refusal to shut up about racial injustice. Her addiction made her vulnerable to a system that was eager to punish her. Club owners turned their back. The government revoked her cabaret license, making it nearly impossible for her to perform anywhere that served alcohol, which, in the jazz world, was almost everywhere. Alcohol had become her refuge, and now it was also the wall closing around her. Once she lost the ability to perform freely, Billie Holiday's world shrank dramatically. She kept drinking, even as her body began to break down. Hospital stays, arrests, and public scandals marked her final years. She was still beloved by many fans, but they were watching someone unravel in slow motion, fighting against an addiction she never truly escaped. In the end, alcohol didn't just numb Billie's pain, it helped end her life. She died in 1959, only 44 years old, with federal agents stationed at her hospital door. Even in her final days, her addiction and her voice threatened systems much bigger than music. Billie Holiday's story isn't just one of self-destruction. It's a testament to how genius and trauma can collide in devastating ways. Her addiction didn't define her talent, but it haunted every step she took. People remember the songs, the voice, the iconic presence, but behind all of that was a woman trying desperately to survive a world that demanded her perfection while punishing her humanity. Her journey remains one of the most powerful and painful examples of an artist lost to the same thing she used to cope with living. Case 3. Whitney Houston. By the late 1980s, Whitney Houston had already achieved what most artists only dream of. She wasn't just famous, she was transcendent. A once-in-a-generation voice whose soaring range and effortless tone made audiences believe in every lyric she touched. But long before the tabloids and paparazzi turned her personal life into headlines, there was a quieter, more private struggle, unfolding behind the stadium shows and platinum records, in hotel rooms after performances, in limousines between appearances, and in moments when the lights went down and the stage went quiet. Alcohol became both a companion and a disguise, something she could reach for to silence the pressure, the expectations, and the relentless scrutiny of fame. Whitney's closest friends would later describe how early success made her incredibly isolated. She was young, soft-spoken, and naturally introverted, suddenly navigating a world of executives, contracts, global tours, and cameras. Alcohol didn't begin as chaos, it began as coping, a way to relax after nights that stretched well past midnight, a pause button after days of rehearsals and interviews, a numbing agent in an industry that demanded perfection. No one watching the glamorous award shows or music videos would have guessed that the woman smiling through rehearsed speeches had already begun a long battle with dependency. As her fame exploded in the 1990s, Whitney's drinking habits intensified. Industry insiders would talk about nights where she appeared withdrawn, exhausted, or emotionally frayed, yet still walked on stage to deliver a performance nobody else on earth could match. The addiction began to coil tighter around her personal relationships. Friends, family, and eventually her marriage began to be affected by the constant anxiety that surrounded her drinking, from missed calls and canceled appearances to moments of erratic behavior that tabloids seized with merciless hunger. Alcohol was no longer simply something she used, it became something that used her. It blurred lines of judgment and fed into a cycle that millions of people struggle with quietly every day, except her pain was public, photographed, and televised. Whitney's voice, that incredible, crystalline gift, started to show signs of strain. There were concerts where she struggled to hold notes she once carried effortlessly, interviews where her speech seemed slower or her eyes distant, and while the world speculated about drugs, insiders emphasized another constant presence: alcohol. She carried the weight of expectation as the voice, the standard against which other singers were measured, and that pressure fed a spiral she longed to escape. Even in the rare moments when she tried to seek treatment and healing, the spotlight never dimmed, and every relapse became a headline. The tragedy of Whitney Houston's struggle lies not just in how it impacted her career, but in how it affected her relationships and mental health. She fought to control it, fought to rise above it, tried to reinvent herself, and still faced that relentless internal battle. By the time she reached her final years, the word icon was inseparable from her name, but so was the narrative of addiction. Millions of fans adored her, prayed for her recovery, and watched with heartbreak as her story became a mirror for the devastating toll of substance dependence. Whitney Houston died at just 48, and although her struggles were complex and intertwined with many issues, alcohol remained one of the persistent shadows trailing her throughout adulthood. Her story is often told like a tabloid tragedy, but it deserves something deeper. A recognition of the human being underneath the legend, the woman who carried extraordinary talent and extraordinary pain in the same body. Whitney Houston's legacy today is bittersweet, a reminder that brilliance does not cancel out suffering, and that addiction does not discriminate, not even against the greatest voice of a generation. Case 4. Marvin Gaye. There was a time when Marvin Gaye's voice sounded like pure velvet, smooth, aching, transcendent. A sound that felt like it came from somewhere beyond the human world. Hits like "What's Going On," "Mercy, Mercy Me," and "Let's Get It On" defined entire eras of soul and R&B music, but behind the controlled elegance of his vocal performances was a man who was almost constantly battling himself. Alcohol didn't come crashing into Marvin Gaye's life overnight. It crept in silently, beginning as a way to calm nerves and silence anxieties, then deepened into a habit he depended on just to keep functioning. Friends would later describe how Marvin would disappear into long nights of drinking, wandering restlessly through studios, hotel rooms, and stages, like a man trying to outrun something only he could see. Marvin's relationship with alcohol was tied directly to emotion. Decades of unresolved trauma from childhood, a strict upbringing under an abusive father, and the crushing weight of fame he never fully wanted. When he couldn't sleep at night, he drank. When he couldn't calm his mind during the day, he drank. During concerts, band members learned to watch his eyes more than his voice. On some nights, he could flow through classics effortlessly, and on others, the alcohol slowed him down, turning verses into long, wandering detours. People who loved him knew he was fighting something invisible but relentless. As the years progressed, Marvin Gaye's dependency spiraled. By the late 1970s and early 80s, he was living in a haze that only seemed to lift when he stepped behind a microphone. He moved between cities, tried to outrun IRS problems, bounced between record deals, and still found himself pouring drinks to ease the same pain music couldn't cure. In interviews, there were moments of heartbreaking honesty. He spoke about addiction as though it were a rival he could never quite defeat. His closest collaborators described a man who could sing like heaven itself, and then retreat into a kind of private hell when the lights went down. One of the most tragic realities of Marvin Gaye's struggle with alcohol was that he understood the danger but couldn't escape it. There were attempts at sobriety, seasons when he tried to live clean, and short stretches of clarity where it seemed like he might turn a corner. But the old demons, loneliness, depression, and unresolved grief always seemed to return. Alcohol masked the immediate pain, but deepened the long-term damage. Everything came to a devastating end on April 1, 1984, when Marvin Gaye's life was cut short in a tragedy that still stings generations later. Hours before his death, he had been drinking heavily during arguments with his father, the man who had shaped so much of his early trauma. The gunshot that took his life wasn't simply the result of one moment of conflict. It was the violent intersection of decades of emotional struggle, addiction, family wounds, and fame that never brought peace. Marvin Gaye's story stands as one of music's most haunting cautionary tales. He was a genius, that much is beyond dispute, but his brilliance came with an internal burden he could never quite put down. Alcohol was never just a substance for Marvin, it was an escape, a whisper of temporary comfort in a life filled with pressure, expectation, and unresolved hurt. Today, people still listen to his voice and feel the layers of ache inside it, the longing, the regret, and the quiet desperation. It's a reminder that some of the most beautiful art in the world is created by people quietly fighting battles they never fully win. Case 5. Rick James. Rick James lived like a lightning bolt streaking across the music world, wild and brilliant, unstoppable, until the very things that made him larger than life began to eat away at him from the inside. At the height of his fame in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he embodied the extravagance of funk and R&B, electric live shows, explosive performances, and a persona dripping with swag. Songs like Super Freak and Give It To Me Baby didn't just climb charts, they defined an era of nightlife, freedom, and theatrical excess. Audiences saw the glitz, the charisma, the outrageous costumes. Offstage, Rick was living a pace that turned alcohol into both a ritual and a constant background presence. He glamorized the party, and then he became trapped inside it. The legend became a lifestyle, and the lifestyle became a dependency. Alcohol wasn't just something Rick used to unwind. It was part of his identity and his image. Interviews from the era capture a man burning through creative energy faster than he could replenish it. Bandmates, engineers, friends, they all later described the same pattern. Long studio sessions fueled by liquor, marathon nights with bottles lining the soundboard, mornings that blurred into afternoons because no one slept when Rick was working. The drinks started out as celebration. Soon they became necessity. Eventually, they turned into anesthesia. Alcohol wasn't Rick's only battle, but it remained a constant that magnified his other struggles. Fame amplified everything. The pressure to outdo his last hit, to perform even when exhausted, to stay relevant in an industry that devours its own. The darker side of addiction started to emerge publicly. His health declined, creative output suffered, relationships burned, then shattered. Former collaborators recall a man who could go from joyful genius to uncontrollable anger in the space of a glass being refilled. The world saw headlines about reckless behavior, lawsuits, and arrests, often treated like TMZ-style spectacle instead of signals of deeper self-destruction. And yet, there were moments when the bravado slipped and the human being showed through. Interviews later in his life reveal flashes of regret, candor, and painful honesty. Rick acknowledged that alcohol took more from him than he ever understood while he was inside it. The time lost, the apologies never given, the bridges burned, and the people who walked away because they no longer recognized the man they loved. In rehab sessions and recovery conversations, he described alcohol as a thief that arrived disguised as a friend. What makes Rick James's story so compelling and so tragic is that he never stopped being brilliant, even when addiction dimmed his light. Late career performances still carried fire. His influence on younger artists, from funk to hip-hop samples, remained enormous. But the cost of the addiction was written across the final chapters of his life. Health failures mounted, legal problems dragged on, and although he attempted periods of sobriety, the damage to his body was already decades deep. Rick James died in 2004, and music historians still argue about how to separate the legend from the pain. The records remain. The hits still play in clubs, movies, and stadiums, and every time the bass drops on Super Freak, listeners get a glimpse of the spark that made him unforgettable. But somewhere behind the sound, there is another truth, that addiction shadowed one of R&B's most unforgettable performers, shaping his choices, haunting his career, and leaving behind a cautionary message about talent, excess, and the things we try to numb when the lights go down. Case 6. Bobby Brown. Long before tabloids made his private life a headline, and long before reality television turned his marriage into a spectacle, Bobby Brown was just a kid from Boston who could electrify a stage the moment he stepped onto it. His voice had attitude, his choreography was sharp, and his presence was magnetic enough to help define the sound of late 80s and early 90s R&B. But behind the platinum albums, sold-out tours, and Grammy wins, alcohol became the constant companion he could never quite outrun. At first it seemed harmless, something to take the edge off after the chaos of fame arrived too fast and too young. But fame mixed with money, pressure, and self-medication is a dangerous cocktail. And in Bobby's case, alcohol eventually became the invisible narrator of his story. The public never saw the earliest warning signs. They only saw a superstar with swagger, launching successful solo records after leaving New Edition, marrying pop icon Whitney Houston, and living what looked like an untouchable life. But privately, the cracks were widening. Drinking became a coping mechanism to mask exhaustion, stress, insecurity, and trauma. And soon it wasn't just a dependency, it was shaping decisions, relationships, and behavior. The business meetings blurred into party nights, the shows blurred into hangovers, and the life that looked enviable on magazine covers was deteriorating in slow motion behind closed doors. By the time legal troubles began piling up, alcohol was no longer just a habit, it was a centerpiece of his public downfall. DUIs, public intoxication, and a string of arrests exposed the depth of his struggle. Interviews and court records showed a man caught between incredible talent and a relentless dependency he couldn't fully control. Fans who had once watched him perform with explosive confidence now watched him stumble, slur, or disappear from stages entirely. Reality television only amplified the tragedy. The show, meant to depict a glamorous celebrity lifestyle, instead broadcast messy arguments, erratic behavior, and moments where alcohol clearly dictated the mood of the room. Viewers weren't just spectators, they became witnesses to a man unraveling in real time. It wasn't entertainment, it was a slow, painful confession without words. Then came the worst chapter: loss. The deaths of Whitney Houston and later his daughter Bobby Christina forced Bobby Brown to publicly confront grief, guilt, and devastation, all while battling the same addiction that had haunted him since youth. Interviews years later revealed a quieter Bobby Brown, one who spoke openly about recovery, therapy, regrets, and the work of trying to rebuild what addiction took. He admitted the cost wasn't measured in money or career opportunities, it was measured in relationships, time, and pieces of himself he would never get back. In recent years, Bobby Brown has spoken more freely about his journey toward sobriety. He has shared about rehab stays, the professionals who helped him, and the resolve to become healthier for the children still living and the legacy still forming. His story isn't clean, and it isn't simple. It is jagged, personal, and ongoing. A reminder that talent doesn't cancel struggle, and that addiction is never a single decision but a series of battles fought in silence long before the world ever sees the fallout. Some people only remember Bobby Brown for controversy, but others look at him as living proof that survival is messy, recovery is nonlinear, and sometimes just staying alive is its own kind of success. Case 7. Chaka Khan. Long before the headlines and rehab announcements, there were early mornings in the studio where Chaka Khan's unmistakable voice would soar through the booth while a quiet storm raged just beneath her surface. She was already a phenomenon when most singers were still trying to find their footing. By her early 20s, she was fronting Rufus, recording hits that would define a generation, and performing for crowds who saw her as invincible, a vocal force who could command funk, soul, and R&B with the same effortless fire. But the music industry has a way of hiding cracks in the brightest diamonds, and Chaka's growing dependence on alcohol became both a coping mechanism and a constant shadow trailing behind every applause-filled night. For Chaka, alcohol wasn't just a party accessory. It became a way to manage anxiety, exhaustion, expectation, and the relentless churn of fame. Touring meant long nights, manic schedules, and a world where vices traveled faster than rest. Her drinking escalated quietly at first, a drink after a show, then a drink before a show, then drinks just to get through the day, until it became something she could no longer disguise. Her loved ones noticed the shifts. Interviews occasionally revealed slurred emotions or unpredictable energy. Yet on stage, her voice remained so electrifying that many fans never suspected there was a battle happening behind the curtain. Chaka Khan has always been fearless about her truth. Unlike so many artists who hid their addictions until disaster exposed them, Chaka eventually spoke openly about it. In interviews, she described how alcohol became a silent killer, especially when paired with the pressure to maintain an image of glamour and strength. She acknowledged dark seasons where she spiraled between guilt, depression, and the desperate hope that things could change if she simply sang through it. There were attempts to quit on her own, attempts to mask the problem by staying impossibly busy, and moments where she nearly lost control completely. The breaking point arrived when alcohol threatened not just her career but her health, relationships, and sense of self. Chaka entered treatment not once but repeatedly, confronting not only the addiction but also the emotional wounds beneath it. She talked candidly about trauma, pressure, and the impossibility of being Chaka Khan every day without any place to collapse. She sought therapy, support groups, and recovery programs. The journey wasn't quick or neatly resolved, but step by step, she fought her way back to clarity. When she finally announced long-term sobriety, it came with a raw honesty that shocked fans and earned respect from countless others. And unlike many artists who disappear after recovery, Chaka returned stronger, releasing new music, performing on global stages, mentoring rising artists, and speaking openly in interviews about the reality of fighting addiction. She became a voice not just for empowerment in music, but for the courage to face demons without shame. Today, Chaka Khan isn't remembered for downward spirals or tabloid drama. She's remembered for her resilience. Her addiction story isn't one of fame destroyed, but fame redeemed through healing. In a world where talent often gets lost in tragedy, Chaka's legacy stands on something rare: honesty, survival, and a voice that sounds even richer when you understand what it survived. Her journey proves an uncomfortable truth. Even the strongest voices can break, and even legends need saving. Case 8. Etta James. There is a reason people describe Etta James's voice as both thunder and velvet. It carried rage, heartbreak, longing, and survival in every note, and behind that unmistakable sound was a battle that stretched across decades. Etta James's addiction story wasn't quiet or hidden in the shadows. It collided with her career in public, brutal, and unforgettable ways. She grew up in instability, shuffled between caregivers, and exposed early to trauma that she never really outran. When fame finally came in the late 1950s, it came too fast and without structure, surrounding her with handlers, opportunists, and an industry that celebrated her talent but did little to safeguard her life. Alcohol became her constant companion, the thing that numbed, disguised, and temporarily silenced the pain she refused to name out loud. In interviews years later, Etta described alcohol as the doorway drug, the thing that lowered her guard, slowed her judgment, and made every other destructive choice feel easier. She talked about how one glass after a show would become 2, 3, then a bottle before sunrise. Friends and tourmates tried to intervene, watching her spiral. Canceled shows, slurred performances, backstage fistfights, disappearances that managers scrambled to cover up. Alcohol wasn't just a private struggle. It became a professional disaster. The more she drank, the more bridges burned. Studios stopped calling, promoters backed out, and those haunting performances that made At Last immortal became fewer and fewer. The 1960s and 70s were a war zone of relapse and attempted recovery. There were brief victories, months of sobriety followed by devastating setbacks. Rehab, relapse, regret, repeat. Etta James never pretended it was glamorous. She didn't excuse it with soft language, and she didn't hide behind guarded metaphors. She admitted the truth. Alcohol controlled her life, damaged relationships, devastated finances, and almost killed her long before her final years. She lost record deals, disappointed fans, and watched peers get opportunities she simply couldn't hold on to because she was battling herself every single day. And yet, what makes her story so powerful is that she kept fighting. Rehab wasn't one dramatic moment of revelation. It was a long, exhausting process. She entered treatment multiple times, and each attempt taught her something new about survival. She crawled her way back into the studio, recording albums in the 1980s and 90s that critics still describe as some of her best work: raw, wise, brutally honest snapshots of a life lived without filters. When she talked about recovery, she didn't preach. She didn't simplify. She spoke like a woman who had lost precious years and refused to pretend everything was fine. That honesty is why fans trusted her, even when the industry didn't know how to handle her. When Etta James died in 2012, the music world didn't talk about perfection. It talked about truth. She didn't pretend to be pure, polished, or untouchable. She was a woman with a gift and a burden, someone who faced addiction without the veneer of celebrity disguise. Her legacy isn't just At Last or those legendary blues ballads. It's the reminder that genius doesn't erase pain, that applause doesn't mute addiction, and that recovery isn't a headline. It's a lifelong fight most people never see. Case 9. Ike Turner. There is perhaps no story in R&B history more tangled in brilliance, violence, success, and self-destruction than Ike Turner's. Long before his name became synonymous with controversy, he was a musical architect. His 1951 recording, Rocket 88, is widely cited by historians as one of the first rock and roll records ever made. And in the decades that followed, Ike became a force in music innovation, studio production, and band leadership. But behind the innovations and industry influence was a man who could not outrun the shadows that followed him from early adulthood. Alcohol wasn't just a social habit for Ike. It eventually became a constant companion, a coping mechanism, and a destructive force that fed into everything chaotic in his personal life. The addiction wasn't sudden. Ike grew up in a volatile environment, surrounded by violence and tragedy, and he carried those wounds with him into fame. Long tours, constant pressure, and unresolved trauma became excuses to keep a bottle nearby. Those who worked with him in the studio recalled days when the music poured out of him effortlessly, followed by nights when he would disappear into a haze of drinking, unable to face the realities building around him. Eventually, alcohol became a fuel that made his temper unpredictable and intensified the worst aspects of his control, especially in his relationship with Tina Turner, which became one of the most publicly documented abusive partnerships in music history. His drinking accelerated every breakdown: band disputes, legal problems, reputation burnouts. Alcohol wasn't the sole cause of the violence or scandals, but it magnified them, making Ike's talent harder to separate from the damage he left behind. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, his career was nearly unrecognizable from its peak. The man who once stood center stage as a trailblazer was now reduced to tabloid headlines, arrests, public feuds, and widespread condemnation. Music insiders described him as someone who could not function creatively without the bottle. A self-sabotaging cycle where addiction destroyed every attempt at redemption. Ironically, toward the end of his life, Ike did try to change the story. Following prison time for drug charges and years spent battling alcoholism, he entered rehab programs and attempted comeback performances. Late interviews and close friends noted that a sober Ike could be disarmingly soft-spoken, reflective, even remorseful. He recorded again, won a Grammy in 2007, and began searching for something resembling peace. But those moments of clarity came late, and didn't erase the years of damage that alcohol fueled in his relationships, his business, and his reputation. Ike Turner died later that same year, leaving the world to wrestle with two truths. He was a musical genius, and he was a deeply harmed, deeply harmful man who never fully escaped the addiction that haunted his entire life. Ike Turner's story is not easily filed under success or tragedy alone. It sits in the uncomfortable space where artistic legacy and personal collapse collide. And for many who look back on his life, the question remains whether he might have been a very different man and created a very different legacy without the bottle that followed him from the beginning to the end. Case 10. Donny Hathaway. There is a particular ache in Donny Hathaway's voice that people still talk about decades later, a trembling soulfulness that made songs like A Song for You feel almost too intimate to listen to. But behind that brilliance was a private darkness, and alcohol became one of the ways he tried to quiet it. Hathaway's struggle was never just about fame or pressure. It was bound up in a battle with mental health that made the spotlight feel both addictive and destructive. By the mid-1970s, while his music career was leaving an unforgettable mark on R&B and soul, Hathaway was quietly slipping deeper into a pattern of drinking that often accompanied intense emotional swings and long stretches of isolation. Friends, collaborators, and producers have spoken over the years about the signs they saw but didn't fully understand at the time. Studio sessions could be magical, Donny pouring his entire being into a single vocal take, and then suddenly derailed by alcohol-fueled anxiety or paranoia. Sometimes he wouldn't show up at all. Other times he arrived so consumed by his internal battle that recording felt impossible. Those around him noticed he often used drinking as a way to cope when the internal noise became too loud to bear. His longtime musical partner, Roberta Flack, once said that Hathaway had a kind of genius she had never encountered before, but also a depth of pain that no hit record could fix. Alcohol didn't write his history alone, but it amplified the demons he was already fighting. As the years passed, the combination of addiction and mental health struggles led to canceled shows, missed opportunities, and a growing fear among his loved ones that he was slipping away. It wasn't the kind of scandal that made headlines in tabloids, and there were no public confessions or dramatic televised breakdowns. In Hathaway's case, the downfall was tragic and quiet, playing out in studios, dimly lit apartments, and hotel rooms, where the weight of fame and pain became unbearable. Those trying to help him faced the heartbreaking challenge of trying to protect someone whose talent touched millions, but whose inner world was collapsing. In January of 1979, news broke that Donny Hathaway had died after falling from a hotel window in New York City. Official reports labeled it a suicide. Others whispered about untreated illness, private battles, and the ways alcohol had pushed him into places where even music couldn't save him. What remains today is not just the loss of one of the greatest voices of his generation, but a stark reminder of how addiction and emotional trauma can intertwine, especially for artists who pour every fiber of themselves into their gift. Hathaway's legacy is still felt in every artist who cites him as influence, in every cover of his songs that tries and fails to capture that same depth of emotion, and in every listener who hears something familiar in the pain buried beneath his melodies. His story is a sobering ending to this list, not because it is sensational, but because it shows a reality many never see. Addiction doesn't always look loud and dramatic. Sometimes it looks like brilliance slowly dimming. One drink, one missed appointment, one unanswered cry for help at a time. Somewhere beneath the platinum records, the magazine covers, and the thunderous applause of sold-out arenas, every one of these artists carried a private battlefield that no camera ever showed. It's easy to celebrate the music, the velvet voices that changed generations, the songs that saved marriages, shaped childhoods, and gave us something to hold on to when life was too heavy. But it's harder to sit with the truth behind them. Unquote. Addiction doesn't care about talent. It doesn't care about success, fame, brilliance, or legacy. It moves quietly, showing up first as a coping mechanism, then a dependency, then a gravitational pull that drags even giants to their knees. Ray Charles once said that the hardest thing he ever did wasn't writing a hit song, it was saying out loud that he needed help. Whitney Houston's voice could silence a room, but addiction silenced her spirit. Marvin Gaye used a microphone to preach love, even as alcohol tried to rewrite his story. And behind every one of these names there are lessons. Pain that was hidden, talent that was almost destroyed, and moments when recovery was not just a career decision, but a decision to keep living. There was something profoundly human in these journeys. These weren't villains or cautionary footnotes. They were people, brilliant, flawed, celebrated, and wounded, trying to manage emotions that felt bigger than themselves. The industry around them often rewarded the performance, but neglected the person. And too many times the applause drowned out the warning signs until it was nearly too late, or tragically, much too late. So here's the question to you, watching right now. Which story hit you the hardest? And do you think the music industry has gotten better at supporting artists through addiction? Or are we still watching talent get destroyed in silence? Let us know in the comment section. Your perspective matters, because these conversations keep memory alive and push for change. If you found this documentary meaningful, if you value real stories, honesty, and deep research like this, go ahead and subscribe to Savage Case Files. Your support isn't just a click, it's encouragement. It tells us to keep going, to keep digging, to keep telling difficult truths that others look away from. We bring new episodes every single day, and we do it for viewers like you. Stay engaged, stay curious, and stay with us for the next investigation.